Let's face it, it takes a certain kind of person to be elite at taking on missions like James Bond does. What we find in traits that characterize James Bond, maybe we'd find in real spies who are good at their craft. So, is James Bond a psychopath? Today we have Dr. Stephen McWilliams, who has written an article, James Bond Has Many Faces, Is He a Psychopath?, for the Journal in Dublin, Ireland, and a book, Psychopath, Why We Are Charmed by the Anti-Hero. He will help us navigate our way through this perplexing question. So psych up for a deep dive into the mind, personality, and psychology of James Bond. Hi, this is Dan.
And Tom.
From our podcast, Cracking the Code of Spy Movies, and our website, spymovienavigator.com, the premier go-to resources for spy movie fans. Now, it's time to deep dive into the mind of James Bond. Let's get those neurons firing. Dr. Stephen McWilliams, welcome to our show. We've been wanting to do this topic for a long time.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I work as a consultant psychiatrist in Dublin, in Ireland, and I'm an associate clinical professor in University College Dublin. And I work in a large psychiatric hospital. So I treat people with psychosis and bipolar disorder and depression and so forth, usually quite severe depression. I tend to try and avoid psychopaths if I can. But it's more of a hobby, if you like. But I suppose in terms of my background, I'm a graduate of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in London. And I've a higher degree, a doctorate in medicine from University College Dublin. I'm the medical editor of Hospital Doctor of Ireland, and I've authored maybe about 320 publications to date.
Wow.
And I suppose the two main books that I've written are Fiction and Physicians: Medicine Through the Eyes of Writers, which was published in 2012, but most recently Psychopath, Why We Are Charmed by the Anti-Hero, which was published by Mercer Press in 2020.
Yeah, now, Stephen, Dan and I both read this last book here, the Psychopath book, and it's a great read. And what I like about it is you're talking there about how you really can't take real people because like, you could get sued or something. So you take fictional characters throughout history, if you will, and evaluate everything we know about them to try to help say, hey, is this person a psychopath? So, for instance, you talk about Frank Underwood from the House of Cards, Hannibal Lecter, a bunch of others, and of course, why we have you here, James Bond. Right?
Yeah.
So, to understand the mind of James Bond, we have to look somewhat at his past. We have to look at Ian Fleming a little bit, and then what primary traits have come out of his past. Now, we talk about psychopath, but what does it really mean? What can you define what the word psychopath means for us?
I suppose, firstly, before saying that, it's probably worth mentioning that when talking about James Bond, we're not really talking about one character, because at least 8 novelists have said, have given their interpretation, obviously Ian Fleming himself. Then a lot of sort of thriller writing and literary novelists subsequently have written about and given their interpretation of James Bond. And also 6 mainstream actors have done the same thing. So he's more of a kind of a genre, really, than a particular character, and some are going to be more psychopathic than others are. But in terms of what, it's worth explaining what a psychopath is. And certainly my book, the way I would define it is, a manipulative person who fundamentally lacks a conscience and has a lifelong history of engaging in a wide range of irresponsible, unethical, and criminal activities for personal gain. Typically, the psychopath will be grandiose, they'll lie, they'll cheat, they'll lack empathy for other people. They'll have no remorse for their transgressions and things that they've done. And they'll typically be, superficially charming individuals as well. And there's a few sort of myths about psychopaths as well. I mean, most psychopaths are not serial killers. People think of psychopaths as being serial killers, but most are not. There are way too many of them. It's estimated that 1 in 200 of us is a psychopath, which means that that's like, 35 million psychopaths in the world.
We're not all Dexter Morgan.
No, absolutely not. No, but it's it's amazing that the number of people who actually are very psychopathic, and these people function perfectly well in society. They carve out impressive careers as CEOs and lawyers and police officers and politicians and advertising executives and estate agents and used car salesmen and soldiers and surgeons and even the odd psychiatrist. So it's there are loads of them around the place. People with a certain amount of psychopathy there. And I suppose the other thing to mention, particularly as I'm here talking to you as a consultant psychiatrist, or I suppose an attending is what you might call the role in America, but Um, Psychopathy is not a mental illness. It's a severe personality disorder. So it's got nothing to do, for example, with psychosis, where people hear voices and see visions of things that aren't there, or have delusions of things that aren't true. Psychosis is a mental illness, but it share the first syllable, if you like, with psychopathy, but they're totally different things.
So how do
Sometimes
you,
in
how do you,
films they're
so,
confused a bit, but they're quite different.
so how do you figure out what traits to look for if you're going to try to identify psychopathy?
Yeah.
A lot of research has been done on this, particularly by a fellow called Robert D. Hare, Professor Hare in Canada. And he is, if you like, the father figure of the study of psychopathy. And he's done it all his life. I mean, he's about 90 now, but he spent his entire life studying, psychopaths and going into prisons and doing interviews and sort of
Wow.
correlating various data and that kind of thing. And he's come up with the Hare psychopathy checklist. And this is accepted as the gold standard for deciding whether or not somebody's a psychopath. And it usually involves a trained forensic clinical psychologist sitting down for a week, going through the entire life of somebody and going and essentially coming up with whether or not these 20 traits that are in existence in the Hare psychopathy checklist have been met. So the score would be out of 40, and if the trait isn't evident, you get 0. If it's there partially, you get 1. If it's definitely there, you get 2. And there's a cutoff of 30 out of 40. But for research purposes, and I think for the purposes of fiction in my book, which is fair enough because we don't know everything about the fictional character, 25 is acceptable. So there are 4 sets of criteria. The first one is interpersonal traits, so how we interact with the world.
Mhm.
So a psychopath will typically have glibness and superficial charm, a grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying. So that means sort of lying relentlessly, even when it's not necessary to lie. And then fourthly, manipulation for personal gain. So this often involves a thing called impression management, where you make a deliberate attempt to try and influence how other people perceive you by controlling the information they receive. So you'd be particularly nice to the individual where you want something from them. You might be very nasty to lots of other people, where
Well,
you don't
wow,
really need
this
anything.
sounds a lot like James Bond already. And we've just started.
He's got a few of those. Yeah, I mean, he definitely ticks 3 out of those 4 boxes. I suppose
Yeah,
because
yeah.
he's a spy, it might be a bit of a stretch to say that the lying is pathological. I mean, he kind of has to lie, doesn't he? Because
Yes, yes,
it's
yes.
part of his
Part of his
job.
job. Right.
That's
On
Good.
true.
the other hand, well, various women that he's seduced and all that kind of thing, he mightn't have told them the entire truth and that kind of thing. So, you might give him
Right.
a half, or rather 1 out of 2 for that particular one.
Yeah.
Yeah, now in your book, Psychopaths, you actually go through each of these fictional characters and look at these traits. So you
Yeah.
break them down based on these traits, which is really kind of cool because
And they get a score.
I've seen this checklist
Or
before. And so it's really cool to actually then see it applied to these fictional characters because I've seen the
Yeah.
checklist, but I really haven't really seen how it actually gets applied. So
Yeah,
so
this is
it's really
good.
nice how you do that.
try and try and bring it to life a bit.
Yeah.
That using these fictional characters, as you say, we can't use real people because we don't want to libel anybody.
Yes.
People generally don't like being called a psychopath. So 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 we go through these fictional characters and yeah, particularly where there have been television series or not, series of novels and lots of films, you have loads of background information on people, so you can apply the Hare psychopathy checklist and make a reasonable stab at trying to to decide whether or not they fulfill the criteria as a psychopath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the second group of traits are the affective traits. So that's how we feel, or in the case of the psychopath, don't feel really. So that they would include a shallow affect, so an impaired ability to feel emotion, even if you can mimic how it looks to other people.
Well,
Callousness or lack of empathy, lack of remorse or guilt, and then a failure to take responsibility for your own actions. So a tendency to blame other people for what you've done, your various transgressions. And again, there are lots of examples of Bond doing all 4 of these as well.
yes, yes,
He's really quite shallow a lot of the time. He has very little empathy for a lot of the people who, even the innocent
yes.
bystanders, and the various women that hasn't saved and all that. He's not that bothered about most of them.
No.
Doesn't feel particularly guilty about what he does. He kills lots of people. Doesn't seem to bother him. And you know, Q's equipment, that he destroys every time. Doesn't bother him.
Yeah.
Doesn't take any responsibility for it. It's not his fault.
Yes.
Yeah. It's, hey,
Please
part of
bring
my
this
job.
back.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So the third group then, or the third category would be the lifestyle trait. So that's how we live, or how the psychopath lives. So a parasitic lifestyle. So taking advantage of the kindness or vulnerability of others, or living off the spoils of others, or I mean, you look at Bond, and he must be on a meager government salary, and yet he always
Yes.
wears the finest suits. He drives an Aston Martin. He's got a nice watch. He's got everything he needs.
Yes.
Stuff he wasn't paid this stuff. He must get it from somewhere.
Yes.
Um, Impulsivity, so acting suddenly without weighing up the pros and cons. Lack of realistic long-term goals, so making plans far beyond one's own capabilities. You'd probably only score 1 out of 2 for that, because he doesn't have any long-term goals at all,
No.
really. He might,
Right.
I don't suppose he expects to live to old age, but
Right.
um,
Yeah.
need for stimulation and excitement, irresponsibility, so not living up to your obligations or commitments, promiscuous sexual behavior, and many
Oh, not
short-term.
Bond. Not
No,
Bond.
no, who would have thought it? Yeah, I know it's really giving him a bad name, isn't it? And then many short-term marital relation, or in brackets marital relationships. I mean, he only has one marriage that we're aware
Yeah.
of, but
Yes.
but he's loads and loads of short-term relationships. I mean, he's probably at his most abstemious in the Fleming novels, to be honest, where he has maybe one
Yes.
girlfriend or relationship per book.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, if you go to the films, I mean, two, three, four per film. There's sort of
Yeah.
there were lots of them during the 60s. They kind of rode back a bit in the 80s, I think, with worries about HIV and various things like
Yes.
that in society. But it's certainly, he has lots and lots of relationships.
Yes.
And then the fourth category, and this is the bit where Bond doesn't score. The fourth category is the antisocial traits, so how we behave badly usually. So these would include poor behavioral controls, early behavioral problems in life, juvenile delinquency, um, criminal versatility. So someone who's criminally versatile commits a lot of crimes, but they don't tend to be the same thing. A lot of criminals will specialize in one thing. They'll be expert burglars, or they'll be car
Yes.
thieves, or they'll do bank heists or something like that. Whereas a psychopath will turn their hand to anything. Any opportunity that comes along, they'll do it. So that's criminal versatility. You tend to see that in a psychopath. And
Hmm.
then finally, revocation of conditional release, so parole violations and things like that. So they don't learn from their experience. They
Okay.
go to prison, they come out again, they do the same thing again.
Yeah. Yeah.
But none of
So,
these really apply to Bond, because he's not a
oh,
criminal, and he kind of tends to toe the line, at least from a government perspective.
yeah. 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 So could you be a psychopath with the first three categories and lacking the fourth?
Yeah, if you score more than, well, 25 for research purposes and 30 for
Yes. There you go.
for real life purposes, yeah, you can, and he does. I calculated he scored 25 out of, he
Okay.
just crosses the
Okay.
line.
Yeah.
So
It
enough for
just
us to like
crosses the
him.
line of like of the
Ju-
psychopath.
Enough
Okay.
for us to like him, but yeah, but he's and he's not a sociopath. There's a the two words are often used interchangeably.
Yeah. We're gonna
Psychopath and
ask.
sociopath. It
Hmm.
happens all the time. You see it in the movies and everything, but they're actually different. As I've just mentioned, a psychopath is very well defined. Lots of research, and we know what a psychopath is. Whereas a sociopath is a much more informal term. It's not well defined, arguably quite obsolete. Um, and it describes an individual with a persistent pattern of behaviors and attitudes that are at odds with what society considers to be acceptable or lawful. That's
Hmm.
much more vague than the psychopath description.
Hmm.
A psychopath operates on their own. They're kind of a shark swimming alone in the ocean, whereas a sociopath, they have behaviors that are appropriate within their own kind of social setting or subculture. Like Tony Soprano, for example, kills,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
count
Yeah.
about 7 or 8 people that he killed during the series. He's kind of got a bit of a conscience. He likes he's nice to his kids. He's he's pretty gritty and nasty, but there's a greater loyalty within his kind of setting.
Yeah,
So
and you
he's a bit
mentioned
of a
that in the book
conscience.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a bit of a conscience, but
Yep.
the psychopath has no conscience, or very little conscience. But the biggest reason probably is what a lot of the researchers would think about what causes it, or what brings it about. So psychopaths are thought to be temperamentally, at least partly temperamentally abnormal from birth. So they're partly born of genetics and biology. But if you
Oh.
put them in then an adverse circumstance, a difficult childhood or whatever, they'll turn into a criminal or a nasty kind of, I suppose in the worst case scenario, serial killer. But if you give them a good childhood, they'll have one of the other outcomes we mentioned, like they'll become a CEO or a successful politician or a barrister or something like that. So the direction they go in and how much they conform will depend on their childhood, but they're kind of predisposed from birth. Whereas a sociopath is thought to be entirely made, that there isn't the biological predisposition, that they're kind of, you take any person who had any opportunity in life when they were born, put them into a difficult childhood, and
Yeah.
and then they'll turn out like that. The psychopath, you could have a psychopath coming from an idyllic childhood and they still end up misbehaving, because it's just in their genes or in their nature.
I see. Yeah, yeah. I like in your book when you say about Bond that he might be the ultimate fictional anti-hero, the psychopath we cannot help but admire.
Yeah, well,
It's kind of how we
everyone's,
all look at him, right? I mean,
yeah, we've like for 7 decades, or more, almost, that we've been looking at Bond in various incarnations, and there's everyone wants the exciting life of Bond. It's all very glamorous and everything. So yeah, he's very compelling.
yeah, yeah, yeah. All right, let's look at some of the things from Bond's past and the characteristics that we often see portrayed by Bond that are part of his persona now. And some of his things like trauma and resilience. We see that in all of the novels, really. We see it in the movies. Can we talk a little bit about those kind of traits and how it permeates Bond?
We talk about his childhood. We don't learn an awful lot about his childhood until nearly the end of Fleming's novels. He doesn't mention the childhood until You Only Live Twice,
Yes.
which was the last novel he sort of saw published when he was alive, and it was the first one to be written after Doctor No had come out in the movies. And of course, people are then curious to know, well, where did he come from? What's his background and everything? And so he kind of had to put something in. So he put M's obituary in, towards the end, and M gives a little bit of background about Bond. So we know he lost both his parents in a climbing accident in Chamonix when he was 11, and his aunt Charmaine became his guardian. So as M's obituary and You Only Live Twice says all this, and so ordinarily, rather than resilience, if anything, losing a parent, particularly a mother, before the age of 13, the research tells us that it typically increases your future risk of anxiety, depression, addiction, various problems in life. But I suppose it's more complicated than that, because how you respond to being orphaned really depends on a few factors. For example, your age when it happens, whether or not your home life was stable or abusive beforehand,
Mm.
the response that people have, to your difficulties afterwards. So an orphaned 3-year-old child, for example, might become very, very clingy. That they need they need attention. And they'll behave badly, or they'll do whatever they can do to get attention. Whereas an orphaned 11-year-old like Bond might develop a difficulty forming close relationships. They'll kind of become distant. They're
Yes.
sort of it's like they're programmed to lose people that they care about. So they don't really trust people enough to get terribly close because they're afraid that they might lose them. So, of course, but this also made Bond very independent and very self-sufficient. And so, the other thing I suppose to mention about Bond is that other than the death of his parents, he seems to have had, quite a nice childhood and quite an idyllic childhood. I mean, he was sent to Eton. He was
Yeah.
expelled and sent to vets, or if I've pronounced that correctly. He was inclined to be solitary by nature, according to M, but he did establish firm friendships amongst the traditionally famous athletes, athletic circles at the school. We're told. Um, so I think his idyllic, not idyllic, but his solid upbringing and his privilege, and the fact that he came from money and that kind of thing, it puts him in a position where he's more likely to become somebody who at least carves out a functioning role in society rather than becoming a criminal.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that's this kind of that's a great summary for this trauma and resilience section.
Yeah.
Now, what about his professionalism, obviously, and his sense of duty? Because again, that permeates all of the novels, it permeates the movies, and he really seems to have this unwavering commitment to his duty as a secret agent, and that's central to his psyche and his loyalty to the mission and to the country, to God, the king and queen. seems to be second to none. He operates with a strong sense of professionalism as this blunt instrument of the government, as Fleming refers to him as, and most often prioritizing his mission really over personal relationships or any moral dilemmas. That, the mission is key.
I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, he has an unwavering commitment to his duty as a secret agent, or it's kind of one of the core things about the whole genre, isn't it? So he's loyal to his mission, to his country. He operates with a strong sense of professionalism, as you say. He's the blunt instrument. He prioritizes the mission over his personal relationships or moral dilemmas. I suppose the absence of these moral dilemmas is actually quite psychopathic. I suppose
you may ask you about that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. You might have heard of the what's they call it, the trolley experiment. They asked a lot of people in a particular research paper. I can't remember the author or the name, but it's quite a famous concept. That there's a train. If you can imagine a train rushing down the track at top speed, and it's the driver has fallen out or fallen asleep or he's incapacitated in some way, and this train is out of control and it's careering down the track, and there are six people on the track way down the line there, and you can see them. The train can't stop. You can't get any message to them, and without a doubt that train is going to crash into them, going to kill those six people. Now halfway down the track there is a lever, and you can pull that lever and the train will be diverted onto another track. And on the other track, there is one person. And that one person is completely unaware of what's going on, and you can't get a message to them either. Would you pull the lever?
That's good.
So there's the question for you now.
That's a great question.
Yeah. Would you pull the lever and
your moral
kill one completely innocent person who is not involved in this to save six people? So I suppose that the thing about this is, I mean, some people said yes, they'd pull the lever, and some people said no, they wouldn't pull the lever. But the important thing is not whether or not you pull the lever, it's how long you take to make the decision.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
the psychopath will make the decision instantly. They instantly know what to do. Yes, I will definitely pull the lever. No, I will definitely I'll leave well enough alone, nothing to do with me. Whereas most non-psychopathic people will take a while to think about it. They'll mull over it and think of the consequences of each and that kind of thing.
Well, if they take too long, they won't have to make a choice.
Well, that's true. Well, if you take too long, of course, you're choosing the six people.
Yeah.
But this is the thing about the psychopath, is that they don't mull over moral dilemmas like that. They just make decisions. And so so Bond doesn't spend much time worrying about his actions. He just gets on. He's a man of action, gets on with it. Now there are a few exceptions. One of the novelists who wrote some of the more recent James Bond novels, there were three of them, in fact, commissioned by the Ian Fleming estate, was Anthony Horowitz. And in Trigger Mortis, which is the first one, Bond is, I think he's on a train. I think he's in the underground or something, and he's wondering whether or not to kill a henchman. And he stops and pauses and decides not to kill the henchman. And it's kind of unusual for Bond, because usually he just kills the henchman. But yeah, I mean, sort of Anthony Horowitz decided to humanize Bond a little bit. I think, to be honest, Horowitz does humanize James Bond more than maybe some of the other more literary Bond authors that followed Fleming, like Robert Markham and particularly William Boyd. I mean, I think his Bond was quite psychopathic, I think. But yeah,
that dilemma you just talked about comes out very strongly when in Spectre, when M says to C, sometimes a license to kill means it's a license to not kill, and you have to make the choice. I forget exactly the words, but he's like
that you have to be there to know whether. Yeah, you have to be there to know whether to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
So I mean, this is the theme, particularly in the more recent film. As the whole genre has matured along with society, I suppose. That it's not enough just to present a very clear black and white who's good and who's bad. Readers and viewers want moral complexity in their in their characters, and so Bond has had to become much more complex in the Daniel Craig years. In fact, it was one of the problems with the Pierce Brosnan films, I thought, is that the moral complexity wasn't catching up with society. And so that's the reason why although they were monetarily successful, I don't think they're viewed as being amongst the better James Bond films, which
Hmm.
is not Pierce Brosnan's fault. I think it's just he didn't get a really good film to make, other than
Yes, yeah,
perhaps
yeah, yeah.
Goldeneye.
GoldenEye was his best, and beyond that, it was like, yikes.
Yeah, they
Or
sort of, they were entertaining enough, but they weren't classics.
yes, exactly. They weren't classics. Now we had kind of mentioned these other characteristics before, his charm and his ability to manipulate people. Let's talk a little bit about that because those are again permeating factors in Bond's character.
I mean, look, he is manipulative. He displays grandiosity. He's glib. He's superficial charm. Think of all those, the one-liners in the films. In Goldfinger, Connery dumps a henchman into a bath and throws an electric fan in and remarks, shocking, positively shocking. And yeah, this charm, it's part of the charisma, and he uses it as a weapon. And he manipulates others with ease. He uses impression management, maintains his poker face to navigate complex social and mission related situations and gather the intelligence that he needs. But the charm is superficial. But Bond he's quite shallow. He lacks empathy. He rarely feels remorse. Doesn't take responsibility for the collateral damage, as you've said. And as I say, there's usually only one Bond girl left per film. The rest of all, sadly, reach their
Yeah,
demise. And of course he's relentlessly careless with Q's equipment. So
yes,
um,
of course.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, but there's no doubt he's very charming and he's very manipulative and he uses
Yeah,
it to his advantage.
yeah, he really does. And even Fleming himself said, I didn't intend for Bond to be likable, and he said he had very few virtues. And in the books you could see that more than in the movies. I think that he is this blunt instrument of the government. He isn't really likable in a lot of ways because of all of the things we're talking about now. But yet the whole point of your book is we're enthralled by these anti-heroes regardless of all of this. That's pretty wild.
I mean, just despite Fleming's intentions, and I think at the very, very beginning, Fleming was only really getting to know the character himself.
Yeah, that's
And
true too.
yeah, like he was sort of experimenting with what this character would be. And of course, he wanted a dull, ordinary fellow that things happen to, which is kind of you can see with a sort of a background in espionage in the Second World War. He worked in Room 39 in the Admiralty
Hmm.
during the Second World War, and he got to see a bit of espionage, not a huge amount of action, but certainly he knew espionage very well, and
Yeah.
he realized that spies are meant to be inconspicuous. They're supposed to be dull and boring and unnoticeable. They're
You mean
not supposed
everybody's
to be
not supposed to know your name? I'm Bond, James Bond. Well, of course you are.
they're not supposed to be 6'2" and look great in a tux, and stand out and always charm the room and everything. They're actually supposed to be really inconspicuous.
Yeah.
So so I think that's probably what he wanted. And he even said about there's a quote in relation to I think in the New Yorker in 1962 or thereabouts when he was talking to them, he said that I heard the name James Bond and gosh, I thought that was the dullest name I'd ever heard, and that's the reason why he used it. Yeah,
Yeah, right. It was yeah, the ornithology author, right? He had a book on his desk in Jamaica with the name James
right.
Bond.
Birds of the
Yeah.
West
Yeah,
Indies. Yep.
And he's
yeah,
like, oh,
that's
that's a
right.
pretty
Yeah, yeah,
boring name. Yeah.
yeah. So there you go.
Uh,
Yeah, he used it.
yeah, that's pretty wild. All right, let's look at his risk taking and his thrill seeking because again, Bond, that's all we see of Bond, right? He's always willing to take a risk. In Quantum of Solace, he knocked out his own guys to escape M and everyone else because he was going to go rogue and do his own thing. He doesn't care about anything. He's going to take his risks. He's going to be a thrill seeker. Let's look at that a little bit. He definitely lives like that.
He does. I mean, it's Bond's his penchant for taking risks. It's a defining trait of his. He's a high need for stimulation and excitement. He's impulsive. He's irresponsible at times. High speed chases, diffusing bombs, confronting dangerous adversaries. He loves the adrenaline rush. He almost welcomes it when it happens. In fact, he doesn't almost, he does welcome it.
Yeah.
Even Casino Royale, he's being brutally tortured, and he sort of quips, I've got a bit of an itch here, and
I love
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
line.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's great.
it's hilarious. I mean, it's I he also likes the thrill of the finer things in life. Bollinger champagne, vodka martinis, Aston Martins, Bentleys, BMWs,
Yeah.
well-tailored suits, expensive rooms. We don't see him in a tracksuit queuing up in McDonald's with a copy of the Daily Mirror under his arm. He's this is a guy who wants the best in life because he finds it thrilling and interesting, and makes him feel good. As I said to you before, spends a lot of money that he doesn't earn.
Yes.
Or at least you could argue he earns it in one sense, but he doesn't technically earn it. He acquires it in
Yes.
various places, and so his lifestyle is quite parasitic as well. It's
Yeah,
not
that's a
it's
good
not as
that's a good phrase. Yeah, he is
Yep,
parasitic in that way. Yeah, yeah.
yep,
That's
totally
good.
agree with you on that. Right. I want to
Yeah.
get into the next topic here then, which is his emotional complexity.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I want to set the stage here because your book came out before No Time to Die. And so when you give us this answer, can you talk a little bit about, how that changed between what we had historically seen of James Bond in the books and the movies, and then what happened? Because the emotional complexity was very different in that movie.
it really changed, didn't it? I mean, yeah, my book, as you say, it was published before No Time to Die premiered, and at that stage, I think I would have said that Daniel Craig, his Bond was really quite psychopathic. It was possibly the most psychopathic we'd seen to date. The funeral scene in Spectre, the recently widowed Lucia Scaria, I think, or is that her name, Scaria?
Sciata.
Anyway,
Sciata, I think. Yeah.
that's it.
Maybe
That's it. Yeah,
Sciata.
yeah. Anyway, she comes up to me, she said, can't you see I'm grieving? And Bond coldly replies, no, knowing full well he's just killed her husband. I think he redeems himself in No Time to Die. Fatherhood is beckoning. It seems to soften him a bit. He's in retirement as well. And I think it's possibly one of the reasons he kind of had to die, because I'm not sure that the public or the viewership will really put up with a softened Bond for too much longer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I do have
I,
one question. I do have one question on that change. And you mentioned fatherhood. Is something like all of a sudden I've got a family a big enough shock to a system to take somebody who is a psychopath and flip them where, okay, maybe they were a borderline, but now I'm a father and this whole part of me has to change. And so maybe I'm not a psychopath anymore. I mean, is that possible?
might change a sociopath. Somebody who's with gangs and that kind of thing, they might try and leave the mafia or something, because they want to be more responsible. Doesn't change a psychopath. I think there's a very reasonable chance that psychopath might initially try and look as though they're turning over a new leaf, but really what's going to happen is they'll turn out to be a dreadful father, and
Mm,
it'll go very badly. Because they're just not capable of the empathy, that's needed
yes.
to rear children. So it's very unlikely, I think, to that truly a psychopath is going to change like that. But I think in the eyes of the viewers with Bond, bearing in mind he's a fictional psychopath, the audience kind of empathizes with him, or identifies with him a little bit more because
Yeah.
he's become a father, and so it softens him in the eyes of the viewership.
I was going to say, so let's take then a step back to pre No Time to Die and
Yeah.
talk about this whole concept of emotional complexity with James Bond. And I'm thinking of things like his relationship with Vesper Lind and how that ends.
Yeah.
I have to say, personally, I wasn't all that convinced by the relationship with Vesper Lynd. I mean, when she died, his immediate response was, "Well, the bitch is dead," and it was, you know, okay, maybe he was just putting that on. Maybe he was trying to appear tough to M on the phone,
Yes. Yeah.
trying to cope with loss and that kind of thing. But it was still quite a whirlwind romance. They barely knew each other a week.
Mhm.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
or maybe a bit longer during while he was recovering from his torture or whatever. But you know, they weren't terribly honest with each other. She had a whole backstory that he knew
Yeah.
nothing about until after she died. I'm not convinced that they had any kind of meaningful relationship, and certainly not one that would have lasted. I think though with Madeline Swan, it's a little bit more convincing. Um,
Okay.
and there are other convincing relationships as well. Particularly, I mean, one of the best James Bond films is On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes.
It's a fabulous, and it's a really
We agree.
underrated film. People
Yes.
don't talk about it that much. They don't show it on television that much. But it's a really good film,
It
and
is.
and Bond is quite human in that. George Lazenby, he lends a kind of complexity, I think, to, and given it's his first and last outing, as James
Yes.
Bond, it's he hadn't had time to settle into the role.
Yeah.
But Bond is, he gets married, and I think the relationship is convincing enough. I don't know if it would have lasted if he'd if she hadn't died, but
Yes.
I mean, again, many many relationships and all that kind of thing. Um, that was quite convincing, and there were various other people, Quarrel in Doctor No, and Tilly Masterson in Goldfinger, and there were
Yes.
a few others, where it humanizes him a little bit, I think.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
by and
yeah. We do see
large,
those snippets of that, yes, in some of the movies. But I always thought that Bond, even for himself, thought I can't be successful in marriage. I can't be successful in a relationship unless I am out of the service. And I always think
exactly.
he was thinking that. When Spectre, he throws the gun away after he meets Madeline Swan. I think in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, he may be thinking I'm out because he was going to quit in that movie.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So I'm thinking that's always in the back of his mind, like I can't do both and be successful. So he at least knew that, but he's still a psychopath, though.
Yes, I mean, these are we're kind of we're talking about the minor details here. He still goes around killing people and assassinating people and all that kind of thing.
And
But
has no remorse.
Yeah,
there
no
there is
remorse.
there is some complexity there. But he's quite hard to read emotionally, I think. And I guess he's meant to be. And
Yes.
sometimes it's because the actors don't put a huge amount of effort into any emotion. I mean, Roger Moore, very entertaining Bond, but not a huge amount of depth in his performance. I think he's great with the humor, and he's even quite camp at times. But
Yeah.
the
A little too much.
he doesn't have anything like the dramatic performance that even you get from Connery or Daniel Craig, and particularly Timothy Dalton. Timothy Dalton's his Bond is probably most closely aligned with what Fleming
Yes.
conceptualized, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I like
And of
that. I
course,
like that.
he was a Shakespearean actor as well.
Yeah, yeah. For Moore, I think his best outing was For Your Eyes Only. I mean, he was
Mm,
tough in that. He had a little more of a combination of characteristics like you saw in Sean Connery, where he was tough
yeah.
enough to kill people and kick the car off the cliff and all that kind of stuff. So it was cool.
They pair
So
they sort of simplified the plot as well. I mean, after
yes,
Moonraker, which did very well, obviously, probably because of Star Wars, they wanted
yes,
something in
yes,
space,
yes,
and then they thought, right, well, we can't better this, so they paired it right back and then produced. I completely agree with you. I think that For Your Eyes Only is by far Roger Moore's best James Bond film.
So then this brings us then to number 6, which is adaptability and intelligence. I mean, there's no doubt that his ability to adapt to various situations was crucial to his success. So can you kind of drill into this a little bit for us?
I mean, there's no doubt about his ability to adapt to various situations and environments. It's crucial to his success. He's survived through childhood, and now he's a senior intelligence officer in MI6. He's intelligent, he's quick thinking, he's resourceful, and it allows him to outsmart his enemies pretty much every time, and he survives against the odds. Gets a bit of help. He's got Felix Leiter by his side. He's got various sidekicks along the way and everything, but he mostly does it himself. And he's very, very resourceful and intelligent individual. I think he's clearly a clever guy.
yep,
In the books, whatever else we might say about him, well above average intelligence. In
yes.
order to be able to not just sort of outsmart the villains and come up with ideas when he would be otherwise stressed, when most people would be sort of frantic and frozen on the spot. He's able to just calmly come up with these solutions. He's a clever fellow, and he's very resourceful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think he does get help often. And I think a lot of times he'd fail without the help he gets. But that's part of his manipulative personality too, is to be able to get that help when he needs it, that people are willing to say, okay, I gotta go help. I gotta do something to help this guy out. So that's part of still his skill and adaptability and intelligence,
Well,
I think.
and he also gets some divine help or luck, if you will. in a lot of scenarios.
Yeah, his
He
enemies
is
can
he,
never shoot straight, and and he
it's
can.
amazing. It's amazing, isn't it? And this is, I would have thought this was kind of espionage 101. It's amazing the people running across your field of vision and guns being fired. And of course, the gun is always right behind you, whereas I think you're supposed to fire in front of the person so they run into it or something, aren't they?
Yeah,
But it's
yeah, yeah. They're not very good, his enemies, at shooting.
they're not.
All right, Stephen, what aspects of Bond's psyche do we find most intriguing or relatable? You said, like we said, that we somehow find this psychopath charming and interesting and likable, despite the fact that he's a psychopath and he does all these crazy things. And I think you say in your book too that people kind of are drawn sometimes to the badness of a person because, in a sense, everybody wants to be like that. Everyone kind of wants to be bad. And he's a unique character. His psychological makeup really is this blend of this intriguing physical and mental abilities he has that contributes to his success. But in espionage with his peers, his enemies, with the opposite sex, he always seems to come out on top and do well, despite his psychopathic traits. and,
I mean,
and here
he
we are
hasn't he
saying
hasn't
Bond's a psychopath. It's kind of cool. There are a number of reasons that readers and viewers like him, though, right? I mean, why do we like this guy?
I mean, it's the same 10 reasons that we like any of the people that I mentioned in the book. There are 10 fundamental reasons why we like a psychopath, and pretty much all of them apply to James Bond. He's calm and he's courageous in the face of danger, which a lot of us are not, so we admire that.
True, true.
He can be a little bit vulnerable at times, as we've seen, on Her Majesty's Secret Service and No Time to Die. So, we like characters who are a little bit vulnerable and show a little bit of vulnerability. Now, it
We can
doesn't show
relate.
very much of it, but here and there.
Yeah, we can
He
relate to him.
appeals to Yeah, he appeals to our societal fascination with secrecy. Ever since Victorian times, Jekyll and Hyde, we've loved secrecy. That's why there's such an enormous industry for spy novels and that kind of thing.
Yes.
We love it when things are kept secret, and particularly where we're made privy to those secrets, which is the fourth reason that, the novels are written from his viewpoint. Now, they're not narrated by him, but he's always in the scene. So we kind of feel as though we're following him around the place. So we feel a little bit privileged there, that so we're not quite taken into his confidence, but we're told everything about him.
Yeah.
We're seduced by his charm. He's a very charming fellow,
Yes.
and we're as seduced as anybody else is. We never find him boring. If you follow him
Definitely.
around, you're going to be entertained, so there's that.
Yeah.
Psychopaths are likable when they have looks, talents, or skills that we admire, and there are loads of them in James Bond. He's good looking, tasteful, stylish. He's a good driver. He's good at combat. He can defuse bombs. He's got endless talents.
Yes.
From whatever lepidoptery,
Yeah.
thunderball, whatever.
Yeah. All right.
So he's got loads of these talents. So we like that. I suppose the most psychodynamic reason would be that he appeals to that part deep within us that longs to be bad, longs to do those
There
kind
you
of
go. That's
daring
what I
things
was
that
trying
we
to
would
get.
never do in real life, So we like to watch other people do them. And then the last two reasons, his victims make him look good. Okay, he may be quite psychopathic, but he's not as psychopathic as Goldfinger, or any or Hugo Drax or any of these
Yeah.
people. These guys are much more psychopathic, and the
Right.
henchmen. So he defeats them, and so he's kind of Goldfinger gets his comeuppance, and we're glad that James Bond won, even though he
Yeah. Yeah.
might be
Yeah.
a little bit psychopathic. And then the final thing is the backdrop makes him look good. Now, mostly it's the Cold War, but the Cold War is a war, and war excuses certain things, and sometimes the end justifies the means, and certain things need to be done in order to protect society, a larger society, and so we forgive certain things, in a character if they're acting in everybody's best interests.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So that's good. That's a great summary, and that's true. All those 10 points are the reasons we like this guy, even though he's a psychopath. This is cool. All right, let's see what this all means. There's this thing called the dark triad, as you've written about and you've talked about a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about this dark triad. And you mentioned it in your article. We know that there's obviously three components of the dark triad, but there's a few other things that are in the James Bond psyche that we need to look at. So the dark triad is composed of three things, and maybe you can talk about each of these: Machiavellianism, subclinical
Easy for you to say.
subclinical narcissism, and subclinical psychopathy. So these are the things that we want to talk about now as it relates to Bond. How does he fit into this dark triad, psych-wise?
There are a couple of articles on this, but the one I'm thinking of is by Peter Jonason and colleagues.
Okay.
I'm looking at it right now. It's I think it was 2010 when it came out. Yeah, a very interesting article, and the idea of trying to sort of diagnose, what are the core personality features of Bond and how does it relate to, people generally and so forth. The term dark triad, yeah, as you say, it refers to a trio of negative personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, which share some sort of nasty features. And Machiavellianism, in most cases, Bond exhibits. He's cunning, he's strategic, he's a willingness to manipulate people and situations to his advantage. He manipulates others by possessing high levels of extroversion. He's got his self-esteem, individualism, competitiveness. I suppose the self-esteem might be a bit debatable, but I'll come back to that.
Okay.
He skillfully plays both sides, navigates complex social dynamics, whether they be situations getting out of danger, creating chaos for the enemy, having to twist people to do what he wants them to do. So, he's the supreme driver of his missions, and on all is fair when you want to achieve a mission.
He
And
certainly
the
thinks that way, yeah.
the subclinical narcissism, it is subclinical. I mean, on the one hand, most narcissists that I know of, and I've come across lots of them, they tend to experience temper tantrums when things don't go their way. They throw their toys out of the pram. And this is fundamentally because deep down they actually have very low self-esteem. And they have, because of that, they have this need to control things around them in order to be able to control the narrative, so to speak. So, I think the subclinical narcissism that's mentioned in the book, in the paper here, it's a little bit debatable with Bond.
Okay.
He must have quite good self-esteem, which is kind of at odds with narcissism to a certain degree. But anyway, but Bond certainly, he's superficially anyway self-confident. He's charming. He's charismatic. And these are hallmarks of narcissism. He effortlessly draws people and leaves a lasting impression. Leaves devastated people in his wake. He must win no matter what. And he has the intelligence and drive and confidence to believe that he can. And yes, there may be bigger goals. For love of country, hate for the enemy, and all that. But he wants to win for himself. As I think his GoldenEye Alec Trevelyan says, for England, James. And he says, no, Alec, it's for me.
Yeah.
And it is for him. He wants to do it for himself. And so there is
Yeah.
that sort of level of narcissism. And then the third one, I suppose, the subclinical psychopathy. We've been talking about that. I mean, as I said, he scores 25 out of 40 in the Hare psychopathy checklist. His superficial charm, glib one-liners, grandiosity, manipulation, callousness, lack of remorse, irresponsibility, parasitic lifestyle. He's impulsive. He has a need for excitement, risk takes, constant one-night stands. And through all this, he's calm under pressure. And normal people aren't like this. He's focused beyond focus, and he's out to win.
Wow. All right. So the self-confidence part is and self-esteem part. I mean, so you think maybe he's not that impressed with himself, or that he has these inner conflicts?
I think he probably is, and that maybe the article is, gets, well, it's not that it gets a little confused here, or it gets a little confusing for me anyway, reading it, that he must have quite high self-esteem, and I think that would be at odds with narcissism, where
Okay.
fundamentally, deep down, narcissists actually have quite low self-esteem, even if they appear to have high self-esteem.
Okay. All right. That's good. All right. Let's look at his personality profile. I mean, the Bond is tough. He's a little arrogant. Yeah, a little. Probably quite a tough personality to really get along with in real life. If you knew a person like this in real life, you would probably think, I can't hang out with this guy. He tends to be more extroverted. Certainly, he seems to be open to new experiences, situations, all 100% of the time. He seems self-assured. These traits help him to persist and succeed in the face of potential rejection. He does get rejected in some of the books with the women that don't go with him at the end, like Moonraker. She doesn't go with him at the end. He does get rejected, but he has all of these traits that help him deal with that, I think. And it helps that he doesn't care about certain people or actions or things. He just doesn't.
Moves on.
It's like he's got to be detached to be successful, right? And it seems like he can do that easily. So there are times we see a softer side of Bond, like we mentioned, Dr. No and Quarrel and Goldfinger with Billy Masterson, but you don't often see that side of Bond. It seems like he's pretty hard and would be a tough person in real life to get along with. But what do you think?
I think he would be a tough person to get along with. He is fundamentally a loner, isn't he? He lives on his own.
That's what I think too.
He's a
That's what I think.
bachelor. Yeah. He's his flat in Chelsea, and that's where he is. He's got one this is in the 50s. He's got one domestic staff who cooks his breakfast the way he likes it, and
Yeah.
he's a bachelor.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, but he is sort of arrogant. He'd be a difficult fella to have as a friend, I think.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
if you take out the fact that you're liable to get shot,
Yeah.
Well, there's that.
Not a bad day.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I like the concept of him being a loner, because I've always thought he was a loner, and he's always with women, he's always doing this, and you don't think of him as a loner, but I think you're onto it. I think he is. He's a loner, and that has certain personality traits too
Mhm.
that permeate the kinds of things you do in life. So let's talk about that
Even
now, because as a loner, how are your social strategies executed? What do you do in your social strategies if you really are a loner and you're a psychopathic loner?
I mean, we sort of talk about the big five, if you like, these core dimensions of personality, and we could, again, talking about James Bond, James Bond psychology. You know, he's not neurotic. He's not particularly conscientious, if you like. He's not terribly agreeable either. But he is an extrovert, and he is open to new ideas, and he's open to doing lots of things that people ordinarily wouldn't do. Not many people will jump out of an airplane without a parachute. You know,
Well,
and
not not many sane
and
people would.
yeah, yeah. Or in fact, most people probably wouldn't jump out of an airplane with a parachute.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be me.
Yeah.
A
So,
perfectly fine
but
airplane?
I
No
would need
thanks.
a push.
yeah, well, I mean, I think James Bond probably had a push, didn't he? But
Yeah.
he ended up having to steal the pilot's parachute, I think, in the opening
Mhm.
scenes of Moonraker. But um, he's, he's well able to maneuver sociably. He can easily establish relationships, wins people over, takes advantage of people where necessary. Again, it's this impression management that he has, this ability to put forth the kind of demeanor that's needed in order to get what you want from the person in front of you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's good. I wanted to ask about altruism, because we always look at Bond thinking, okay, he's there for king, country, and queen, and the mission and everything else. And the dark triad, all the stuff we just talked about, all the personality traits we just talked about, and everything else, it doesn't really necessarily make him unaltruistic or antisocial. Yeah,
mhm.
instead, they kind of reflect this self-serving strategy that aligns with his mission objectives. Sometimes that can be altruistic by accident, or just because they align one way or another. I remember the story about Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, when he was returning home to the White House in a horse-drawn carriage, he was discussing altruism with his aide in the carriage, and the president was arguing that there really is none. And Lincoln sees this pig stuck on the fence, and he tells the driver to stop the carriage, and he gets his aide and says, go free the pig. And then the aide said to the president, "See, Mr. President, that was an altruistic act." And then the president, who was arguing against it the whole time, said, "No, that wasn't. If we didn't free the pig, I wouldn't have been able to sleep tonight." So it's like, okay, so there you go. It was still for me. And I think Bond is kind of like that too. It's for him. Everything he does, and it may align with what might look like altruism, right? So I don't know.
I mean, just because he's doing it for himself doesn't mean he's not also doing it for other reasons. I mean, he needs to get paid as well, doesn't he? And of course, he's very patriotic. He clearly believes in serving Her Majesty.
Yes,
And that's kind of his raison d'être. He sort of, if he didn't, he could be a hired assassin. He could easily be a mercenary or something, if he didn't
Yes.
have this if he was antisocial, he'd be an assassin. But because he doesn't have any of the antisocial traits, he aligns the other things with the other items on the psychopathy checklist with Queen and Country.
Yeah, yeah. There you
It's,
go.
yeah.
So not antisocial, not a sociopath, but still, he's still a psychopath. And then you mentioned he has no long-term goals, and I think that's part of how he lives his life, right? He's in a business that
Mhm.
he says at one point, double O's don't have a very long life expectancy.
Mm.
So your mistake here, don't worry, it'll be short-lived, hiring me. So it's like, okay. So yeah, so that's all part of his personality, and you see
Mm.
that really, other than the last movie where he was going to retire and he's going to be married and whatever. He had no long-term plans. He had nothing that would.
It's like the Jack London quote in uh, No Time to Die. I will not waste my days trying to prolong them.
Yes.
He lives for the day. He's very much he's a here and now kind of guy.
Yep.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
All right. Now,
Yeah.
Stephen, we're taking what you talk about in your book and applying it to James Bond. In your book,
Mm.
you apply it to not just spies. You take some people who are actually from like some short stories by Poe, or you do look at Sherlock Holmes. Is he a psychopath? But when we look at it from the world of the spies, is a psychopath really going to make a good spy or an action hero?
I think probably not. If
Okay.
we're honest about it, there's a fellow called David Cox, and he's a professor of psychology in Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and he studied bomb disposal experts in the Northern Ireland Troubles, some decades ago. At the outset, the researchers they anticipated that psychopaths would possess the need for excitement and the requisite fearlessness in the face of adversity, and that they'd combine to make them, just ideal for the job, just perfect, But instead, what they found that most soldiers viewed their psychopathic colleagues as being unreliable and impulsive, with insufficient attention to detail to allow them to practice safely.
Wow.
So the few who made it through training, they didn't last much longer afterwards. So we're left wondering, whether a psychopath would really make a good spy, given his lack of allegiance to comrades or causes, and his unreliability, and his impulsivity, and his carelessness. As I said before, I think in any case, James Bond, or at least most versions of him, ought to make an absolutely dreadful spy. He's dashingly handsome, and he's anything but inconspicuous, and destroys almost every location he visits, and then he drinks so much he must be constantly inebriated or hungover. And as you said before, he relies on a lot of luck as well for his triumphs. But I guess these are the traits that make him exciting and likable as a fictional character, and it's the reasons that we find him compelling. As we watch him, on in film.
Now
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
actually brings me to something that kind of tying back to something from earlier. You talked about the fact that you've got the 6 different actors who've played Bond.
Hmm.
Do any of the actors fit the psychopathic profile more than some of the others?
You can really divide them in two. I think that Connery and Craig and Dalton do a pretty good job of the kind of the psychopathic, fairly tough, hard spy, the more believable, if you like, spy. The other three, Lazenby didn't get much of a chance, to be fair, but Moore and Brosnan, it's a little bit more sort of Disney,
Mhm.
a little bit sort of it's not quite, it doesn't have quite the edge. It's very like lots of humor and very entertaining, and they're very charming actors, both of them. But I think that Connery and Craig are the most psychopathic, and I guess because as I said, the complexity of the narrative that's required as society matures. As people kind of, people expect more from their heroes and villains, and they expect it to be more than just black and white, who's good and who's bad. Craig is the ultimate winner, I think. He's the one who plays the psychopath best, up until No Time to Die, of course, which is when he kind of,
Yeah.
not quite so sure after that. But, I guess, I mean, these are fictional characters. They're never going to be perfect examples of, what we see in real life. And I guess, if anything, the complexity probably adds to the realism, because there is complexity in real life, and not everybody fits an archetype.
Yep. And your comment about Craig in No Time to Die, I've said on our program many times that I don't know what they did with the character in that book. In that last movie, it
Yeah.
wasn't James Bond. A really good action movie, but it wasn't James Bond. It was like, who is this guy? It's not the guy we know.
Flip the switch and boom.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, and I think the producers have kind of dug a bit of a hole for themselves as well because he's dead now. So
yes,
so I
they're
don't
in a
know,
quandary.
does he emerge from the smoke or something and turns out that he's just very badly burned, or what's
That's
going
the
to
good
happen?
thing
What's going to
about
happen now?
fiction. That's a good
Yeah,
thing about fiction. All you have to do is write it and it's done.
yeah.
Boom. He comes out of the smoke. He's fine. All right. Yeah. So, Stephen, we loved your book. We loved reading your book. If
Yep.
people want to know more information about you or where they can find out how to purchase your book, Psychopath, Why We Are Charmed by the Antihero, what should they do?
Well, it's on Amazon. I can't imagine it's in many American bookshops, but it's on Amazon, so it's freely available there. Or I've got a website, stephenmcwilliams.net, which will direct people to where to buy the book as well.
Okay, good. We'll put a link to on our website and the article on that to your website as well. All right. Thanks for joining us today, Stephen. This was a fascinating conversation.
Absolutely.
We can go on forever about James Bond and being a psychopath. It was fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed having a chat about my favorite topic.
There you go. All right, that's a wrap of our psychological foray into the mind of James Bond. We want to thank Dr. Stephen McWilliams for joining us today for this deep dive into the mind of James Bond. This has been Dan
And Tom
of SpyMovieNavigator.com and our podcast show, Cracking the Code of Spy Movies. Subscribe to our show and our YouTube channel as well. Thanks for listening. We appreciate it.